In this lecture, we will review the major models and psychological perspectives. To be human is to be curious about ourselves and the world around us. Before 300 BCE, the Greek naturalist and philosopher Aristotle theorized about learning and memory, motivation and emotion, perception and personality. Today we chuckle at some of his gestures. So long before the new science of psychology became organized into different branches or schools of thought, each promoted its pioneering thinkers. Two early schools of thought were structuralism and functionalism. Structuralism is an early school of thought promoted by Wundt and Titchener. They used introspection to reveal the structure of the human mind. Functionalism is an early school of thought promoted by James and influenced by Darwin. It explored how mental and behavioral processes function and how they enable the organism to adapt, survive, and flourish. The five major psychological perspectives, which I expect all my students to know, are cognitive, behavioral, psychodynamic, humanistic, and your bioneurosciences. Psychology's current perspectives include evolutionary, behavior genetics, and social cultural. In psychology's early days, many psychologists shared with the English essayist C.S. Lewis the view that there is one thing and only one thing in the whole universe which we know about more than we could learn from external observation. That one thing, Lewis said, is ourselves. We have to, so to speak, inside information. Wundt and Titchener focused on inner sensations, images, and feelings. James also engaged in introspective examination of the stream of consciousness and of emotions. For these and other early pioneers, psychology was defined as the science of mental life. That definition endured until the 1920s, when the first of two provocative American psychologists appeared on the scene. John B. Watson and later B.F. Skinner dismissed introspection and redefined psychology as the scientific study of observable behavior. After all, they said, science is rooted in observation. You cannot observe a sensation, a feeling, or a thought, but you can observe and record people's behavior as they are conditioned, as they respond to and learn in different situations. Many agreed, and behaviorism was one of the two major forces in psychology well into the 1960s. So, in behaviorism, it is the view that psychology, 1, should be an objective science, that 2, studies behavior without inference to mental processes. Most psychologists today agree with the first, which is studies behavior without reference. The other major force was Freudian psychology, which emphasized the ways of our unconscious mind and childhood experiences affect our behavior. In another lecture, I will talk more about Sigmund Freud's teaching, including his theory of personality, his views on unconscious sexual conflicts, and the mind's defense against its own wishes and impulses. Let's move on to humanistic psychology. As the behaviorists had rejected the early 1900s definition of psychology, other groups rejected the behaviorist definition. In the 1960s, humanistic psychologists led by Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow found both behaviorism and Freudian psychology too limited. Rather than focusing on conditioned responses or childhood memories, the humanistic psychologists focus on our needs for love and acceptance and on environments that nurture our limited personal growth. Psychologists in the 1960s pioneered a cognitive revolution, leading the field back to its early interests in how our mind processes and retains information. Cognitive psychology today continues its scientific exploration of how we perceive, process, and remember information, and how our thinking and emotion interact in anxiety, depression, and other disorders. The marriage of cognitive psychology, the science of the mind, and neuroscience, the science of the brain, gave birth to cognitive neuroscience. This specialty, with researchers in many disciplines, study the brain activity underlying mental activity. Today's psychology builds on the work of many earlier scientists and schools of thought. To encompass psychology's concern with observable behavior and with inner thoughts and feelings, we now define psychology as the science of behavior and mental processes. Let's unpack this definition. Behavior is anything an organism does, any action we can observe and record. Yelling, smiling, blinking, sweating, talking are all observable behaviors. Mental processes are the internal, subjective experiences we infer from behavior, sensations, perceptions, dreams, thoughts, beliefs, and feeling. As we know, the nature-nurture issue is a long-standing controversy over the relative contributions that genes and experience make to the development of psychological traits and behaviors. Today's science sees traits and behaviors arising from the interaction of nature and nurture. Evolutionary psychology is the study of the evolution of behavior and the mind using principles of natural selection. It differs from behavior genetics, which is the study of the relative power and limits of genetic and environmental influences on behavior. Psychology's first 100 years often focus on understanding and treating troubles such as abuse and anxiety, depression and disease, prejudice and poverty. Much of today's psychology continues to explain such challenges without slighting the need to repair damage or cure disease. Martin Seligman and others have called for more research on human flourishing. These psychologists called the approach positive psychology. They believe that happiness is a byproduct of a pleasant, engaged, and meaningful life. Thus, positive psychology uses scientific methods to explore the building of a good life that engages our skills and a meaningful life that points beyond ourselves. So, let us talk about psychology's three main levels of analysis. Each of us is a complex system that is part of a larger social system. But each of us is also composed of smaller systems, such as the nervous system and body organs, which are composed of yet still smaller systems like cells, molecules, and atoms. These tiered systems suggest different levels of analysis, which offer complementary outlooks. Each level of analysis offers a perspective for looking at a behavior or mental process, yet each by itself is incomplete. Together, they complement one another. Consider, for example, how they might shed a light on anger. Someone working from a neuroscience perspective might study brain circuits that cause us to be red in the face and hot under the collar. Someone working from an evolutionary perspective might analyze how anger facilitated the survival of our ancestors' genes. Someone working from a behavior genetics perspective might study how hereditary and experience influence our individual differences in temperament. Someone working from a psychodynamic perspective might view an outburst as an outlet of unconscious hostility, possibly stemming from childhood experiences. Someone working from a behavioral perspective might attempt to determine what triggers anger responses or aggressive acts. Someone working from a cognitive perspective might study how our interpretation of a situation affects our anger and how our anger affects our thinking. Someone working from a social cultural perspective might explore how expressions of anger may vary across cultural contexts. The point to remember, like two-dimensional views of a three-dimensional object, each of psychology's perspectives is helpful, but each by itself fails to reveal the whole picture.